Everybody, my name is Josie Luce, and today I will be presenting on the Rape of Nanking, a forgotten atrocity. This presentation aims to shed light on a tragic event in history that is often overlooked but holds crucial lessons for humanity. The Nanking Massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanking, took place over 6 weeks, from December 1937 to January 1938, during the Second Sino-Japanese War. This event is remembered as one of the most brutal episodes of modern warfare, involving atrocities that left deep scars on the collective memory of the world. By examining this history, we seek not only to honor the victims, but also to ensure that lessons are learned to prevent such tragedies in the future. Today, we'll address 3 key objectives. First, we will explore the events leading up to the Nanking Massacre, understanding the historical context that set the stage. Secondly, we will examine the profound and far-reaching impact this event had on the victims and survivors. And finally, we will discuss the aftermath and delve into its enduring historical significance. To start, we need to go back to the roots of the conflict that led to the atrocities, specifically the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Second Sino-Japanese War began on July 7, 1937, and concluded on September 9, 1945. It originated from escalating tensions and territorial ambitions in East Asia. The war's earlier counterpart, the First Sino-Japanese War, was seen as a victory for Japan. However, in the second conflict, resistance from Chinese forces was stronger, leading to widespread destruction and human suffering. These tensions eventually accumulated in atrocities such as the Nanking Massacre. As tensions escalated, Japan's aggressive expansion moved rapidly from conflict to full-scale invasion. The Marco Polo incident of July 1937 marked the beginning of full-scale war between Japan and China. And if you don't know what the Marco Polo Bridge incident is, it is where the Japanese soldiers had blown up the Marco Polo Bridge and had blamed it on the Chinese. That way they could declare war against them. Japan's military had quickly advanced into Chinese territory, committing all sorts of atrocities along the way. After intense fighting, the fall of Shanghai in November 1937 proved to be a pivotal moment, leaving Nanking, the capital at the time, vulnerable for such attacks. Following the fall of Shanghai, the stage was tragically set for one of the most horrifying sieges in modern history, the Battle of Nanking. By December 1, 1937, the Chinese government had abandoned Nanking. The defense of the city was left to unprepared and untrained troops. As the Japanese forces closed in, their superior military strength and ruthless tactics had overwhelmed the defenders, leading to the fall of Nanking by December 13th, as the Japanese military had seized control, beginning the widespread atrocities. Once the city fell, what unfolded over the next 6 weeks was a campaign of violence that defied comprehension. For 6 weeks, the city of Nanking was subjected to relentless atrocities. Entire families were slaughtered, and an estimated 20,000 to 8,000 women were subjected to horrific acts of sexual violence, which often was followed by mutilation and murder. Bodies of these victims were left in the streets for weeks, a chilling reminder of the scale of the tragedy. murder, and assault that had happened. The brutality had took many other disturbing forms. The atrocities had extended beyond mass killings and sexual violence. Japan troops had engaged in acts of torture, mutilation, and dismembered civilians. They had also bombed, set fire, and completely destroyed buildings, including hospitals. Such inhumanity, we need to look deeper into the psychological and cultural force driving the perpetrators. To understand these atrocities, we need to examine the culture and ideology that fueled such actions. Japan's military culture had emphasized absolute obedience to superiors and the emperor. Soldiers endured harsh training methods, including physical abuse, creating a cycle of dehumanization. Propaganda had also depicted the Chinese as inferior, justifying extreme violence and diminishing empathy along the soldiers. That way, they wouldn't feel anything while they did what they did. However, it wasn't just ideology, it was also systematic failure and strategic use of terror that had made these crimes possible. There were breakdowns of command and law, with many officers either ignoring or encouraging these atrocities. The lack of accountability had created an environment of lawlessness. Sexual violence was not only tolerated, but it was often used strategically as a tool of war, aiming to terrorize and demoralize the population. In midst of the darkness, however, a glimmer of humanity had remained, thanks to the courageous actions of foreign nationalists who refused to look away. A safety zone had been established by foreign nationalists living in Nanking. They had established the safety zone on the eve of the breakthrough of the Battle of Nanking. This safety zone was created by John Rabe, a Nazi Party member, and other members. This zone had provided refuge to thousands of Chinese civilians. Their courageous efforts had saved over 30,000 Chinese lives during the time of unimaginable despair. Now I want to look at some victims' accounts, as there's no true greater impact of the Nanking Massacre that is best understood through the voices of its victims. So we have testimonies from Yi Xilin, Ni Quping, Xia Shuqing, Zhu Ziqing, Miss Zhu Gao, and Wang Changxin. So sorry if I pronounced any of that wrong. I did use a translator app to try and pronounce the words correctly, but I'm not entirely sure. So let's take a look first at Yi Xilin. Take a look at Yi Xilin. I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I looked up how to say it, and that's how the translator that I used, that's how they said it, but I'm still not 100% sure if that's how. So I'm so sorry if I'm butchering his name. Yes. So Yi Xilin was born on May 6, 1923 in Nanking, China. He had remembered that in August 1937, Japan planes had started to fly over the city and, bomb buildings and destroy destroy houses. And while these bombings had happened, he said that his family had hid in caves to avoid getting bombs, and that many other families and civilians had actually also went and hid in caves to take refuge. He said that um, when the Japanese soldiers had invaded Nanking and finally broke through into Nanking, his family had went to the safety zone. However, the safety zone wasn't as safe as it really was. It did save a lot of people. However, the Japanese soldiers could still go in there, and they did go in there to search for quote unquote flower women, which was really just, women that the Japanese soldiers had found beautiful, and women that they had um, brought away to essentially sexually assault them and everything in between. Um, and then Yi Silin had said that he had to leave the safety zone as Japanese troops had actually, during the massacre, had seized the safety zone, so he had to flee away, and he remained in a different refugee zone until the end of the massacre. So let's talk about Ni Ping. Ni Ping had lived near Chatonian Palace with his family, and when the Japanese took Nanking, him and his family had fled to Sangsin-He to take shelter and hopefully evade the Japanese. However, that was not the case. The Japanese had come to Sangsi-He, and so because they were in that town, his family could not eat for several days because they were too scared to go out and try and wash their vegetables at the river and try and wash some rice. And they couldn't use their stove because if they used their stove, smoke would come out of the house, and that would um help the Japanese soldiers detect that they were in fact there and that people were hiding in this home. And so they did not eat for 7 days straight. It was to the point that they could not take it anymore. And so Ni Ping's father had tried to quietly go out to the river to try and wash some vegetables and wash some rice for his family to try and get them food. And unfortunately, the Japanese soldiers had seen him and they shot him 3 times. And when his mother had heard the gunshots, she had run out to see her husband getting shot. And the Japanese soldiers had then turned to her and turned the gun on her. And that's when Ni Ping had come out and saw that his mother and father were both dead on the ground. And the Japanese soldiers shot him in the shoulder to I believe it was 2 to 3 times. No, he got shot in the shoulder, and one by one his family kept coming out and kept coming out until 7 of his family members were dead. Now he thankfully survived, and he got to be with his aunt and uncle. He ran away, he got to be with his aunt and uncle. However, he did not get medical treatment, so he couldn't get medical treatment. There was no place to go, and so his aunt removed the bullet for him, and he had to essentially just hope and pray that it wouldn't get affected. And there was one time where worms almost got into his wound, and it was really a close call for him, but thankfully he survived, and he is able to tell this story for us. So thankfully he is alive. Now let's talk about Sia Su Quinn. So he had a family of 9 who were living together. Him and his family of 9 were living together. So the Japanese had come into his home, and out of the 9 people he was with, only him and his little sister survived. The Japanese invading their home was essentially like a little massacre in itself. Um, the person who opened the door was immediately killed. His mother was hiding under a table with his 1-year-old little sister, and the Japanese soldiers had ripped the baby out of his mother's arms and just threw the baby across the room to kill her, and they did. And his mother was then stripped down and gang raped repeatedly. And then was brutally murdered. And the Japanese soldiers had went more into the house, and his grandparents and his 2 older sisters were hiding in one of the bedrooms. And at first, the Japanese soldiers had tried to take off the 2 older sisters' clothes and try to rape them. However, his grandparents had really fought back against the Japanese soldiers to try and stop this. However, they unfortunately died. They unfortunately got killed by the Japanese soldiers. And then the 2 sisters were gang raped, and their grandmothers, it was terrible, to say the least. It was really bad. Inanimate objects were put into their private parts, and he had to see this, and he himself was crying, and because he was in the room with them. He was in the room. He was trying to hide under a blanket. However, when he saw his sisters and grandparents be murdered and all what was happening to them, he started crying. And so he was stabbed in the back 3 times, and he then passed out. And when he woke up, the Japanese soldiers were not there anymore. However, he heard his sister in the back crying, and so he got to her and he realized that he and his sister were lying in a pile of his dead family. And thankfully, he was able to go live with his uncle. However, his uncle was not was pretty poor himself, and so it was really hard for him growing up, especially seeing all of those atrocities. He really had trauma because of that. I mean, who wouldn't, you know? So it was very, very hard for him. Um, I want to take a look at Xu Ji Qing, so sorry. Zhu Ji Qing, so sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. That's how a translator app had said it was pronounced, but I am so sorry if I am pronouncing it wrong. So, Xi Jinping was born on February 16th, 1925, and his mother, sisters, and him had all fled to the refuge area when the Battle of Nanking was happening. And when the Japanese soldiers had taken over Nanking and finally, won the Battle of Nanking, so they took over Nanking, they had issued certificate of good citizenship, and that was really mainly to try and get the Chinese people more under their control, that if they could get this certificate, maybe they wouldn't be treated as badly. However, that wasn't the case. Even with this certificate of good citizenship, they weren't treated well. The Chinese people were still all basically treated the same, inhumane and terribly. At some point, Xi Jinping had got to leave the refuge area and got to go back to his house to see where, if it was still there and stuff like that. However, his house unfortunately was burned down by the Japanese soldiers, and he was with his brother and brother-in-law at the time. And while they were walking around, the Japanese soldiers had saw them and had come up to them and was extremely angry. They were yelling at them, they pointing their guns at them, and essentially they made his brother and brother-in-law strip down naked in the road for everyone to see, to search them, see if they stole anything. And they had pointed their guns at them, threatened them from a little bit more, and then when Zichang's queen was basically begging for their lives, that's when the Japanese soldiers had let them go. Another victim we are going to be talking about is Miss Zhu Gao. Miss Zhu Gao fled to the refuge zone with her two young children after her husband and brother were both killed by Japanese soldiers. During this time, she saw many atrocities, such as a pedestrian hacked at the back of his head by Japanese soldiers, and a soldier ripping open a man's stomach while also cutting off another man's head. She had then fled to the countryside in Huan and had stayed there until the end of the massacre. The last person that we are going to be talking about today is Wang Tangxin. Now, um, Wang Tangxin, at the start of the Nanking massacre, 4 of her family members had been taken and never came back. And pretty early on in the massacre, she was driven out of her home by the Japanese soldiers. Many civilians were driven out of their homes by Japanese soldiers. That way they could loot and rob and just take whatever they wanted from the Chinese people. Wang Tangxian had first taken shelter at the San Antonio Lane. She had taken shelter there at the beginning of the massacre. However, Japanese soldiers had invaded San Antonio Lane eventually, so she had to leave to make sure that she wasn't caught by by the Japan soldiers. And so she had fled from San Antonio Lane to Gilling College. And she stayed at Gilling College until the end of the massacre, when she was able to go back home. At San Antonio Lane, Wang Tangxin had seen very many atrocities. She had, just seen many killings of people and sexual harassments and assaults and rapes, and it wasn't a great place to be, and she had to leave. And it just shows how terrible it truly was for each victim to just be here, to be in Nanking during this time. It's very, very terrible. It's a very terrible atrocity. Let's move on to the Japanese soldiers' accounts. Now, I couldn't find individual soldiers talking about their experience, their accounts. I could only find an article with anonymous soldiers' accounts. So that is what I am using. So a couple of the soldiers had said that superior officers to them had told them to commit robbery, rape, arson, and murder. So the superior officers were encouraging and making sure that the soldiers committed these atrocities and would do such things. And many soldiers had said that they would hold women down as a team and would take turns with her. So, a couple of people would hold her down and then they would switch and take turns. And the most disturbing part about this whole thing with the Japanese soldiers' accounts is, out of 250 soldiers that were interviewed, only 3 showed remorse. So 147 or so, 146, 147, didn't feel any remorse. They didn't think that what they had done was wrong. They believed that because it was war, it didn't really matter what happened to their victims, and they didn't really care that they had done these atrocities in the first place. However, one of the soldiers who did show remorse and were remorseful had said that he was haunted by the Chinese after the massacre because his conscience was so guilty about what he had done that he had never been able to get away from the Chinese, essentially, because they always came back to haunt him. Which is, it's very crazy that only 3 out of 250 shown remorse. Now, let's turn our focus to some individuals instead. Were in command during the massacre, those whose decisions or lack thereof played a very defining role in this massacre. So let's look at General Iwan Matsui. He was the commander of the Japanese Central China Front Army that captured Nanking. However, he wasn't actually in Nanking until a few days after his troops, because in the days leading up to the massacre, he fell ill and temporarily abandoned his group. Upon rejoining his troops on December 17th, he had witnessed the aftermath of the atrocities. So he wasn't originally there when the atrocities were occurring. In fact, many of his soldiers had actually tried to hide what was going on from General Iwan Matsui. They had told him about the robberies, however, they were not going to tell him about the other atrocities. However, Matsui did find out, and when he found out, he expressed sympathy for the victims, describing the massacre as a tragedy, yet his remorse came way too late to stop the devastation. The devastation continued, and he wasn't there to stop it. Figure in the atrocities was General Akiramoto, whose role spanned more than just Nanking. General Akiramoto was promoted to vice chief and led troops through the most horrific phases of the massacre. He was not only implicated in the Nanking massacre, but also the Manila massacre. He was then convicted of war crimes and was executed by hanging on December 23, 1948. His actions remain a stark reminder of the role military leadership in perpetrating war crimes is. Responsibility lies with military leaders. Government officials like Koki Hirotoa also bear a heavy burden for what happened at Nanking. Koki Hirota served as Japan's foreign minister during the massacre. Although he received detailed reports of the atrocity from the Japanese consulate in Nanking, he failed to intervene or inform higher authorities of what was happening. While Hirota was never physically present in Nanking, his inaction made him complicit to what was happening. He was then convicted of war crimes and executed by hanging in 1948. It wasn't also civilians who suffered. Chinese soldiers faced brutal, systematic execution after capture. Chinese soldiers captured by Japan forces were subjected to systematic executions. They were separated into small groups, taken to the outskirts of Nanking, and killed in mass executions. Beheadings were common, with bodies either disregarded in mass graves or left exposed on the streets for people to see. It was a chilling testament to the brutality of this massacre. King didn't fade with time. The massacre's legacy continues to shape international relationships and collective memory. The recovery of Nanking was a slow and painful process. Abandoned as the capital city, it became a symbol of China's suffering during the war. Relations between China and Japan remained strained, with anti-Japanese sentiment and continued calls for justice, highlighting the enduring impact of the massacre. In recent years, efforts to promote awareness have grown, emphasizing the importance of reconciliation and remembrance. Of the atrocities, global reactions at the time were surprisingly muted. During the massacre, global attention was limited due to ongoing tensions and conflicts. Western nations issued protests but refrained from taking concrete action. However, journalists like Tilman Durden bravely reported the atrocities, exposing the horrors that happened at Nanking to the international community. However, justice did eventually come in the form of war crime tribunals that sought to hold leaders accountable. Justice for Nanking came in the form of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal and the Nanking trials held in China. General Iwan Matsui was one of the key figures held accountable. Ultimately, he was found guilty and executed. These trials were pivotal in addressing the responsibilities of wartime leaders and acknowledging the crimes committed. In Japan, the official response to these trials and to the massacre itself has been anything but uniform. Japan's response to the Nanking massacre has been deeply polarized. While some leaders offered formal apologies and recognized that the event happened, others downplay or deny that it happened to begin with. This division continues to fuel many debates and controversies in Japan, and it also affects diplomatic relations with China still. There are troubling efforts to deny or distort the truth of what happened. The denial of the Nanking massacre remains a significant issue in Japan. Claims of fabrication or exaggeration have led to political debates and movements aimed at discrediting the historical narrative around the Nanking massacre. These efforts undermine acknowledgement and hinder reconciliation between China and Japan altogether. This denial has fueled political and academic controversies, influencing how history is taught and remembered. Political debates over government acknowledgement, national movements denying the massacre, and textbook revisions minimizing the event's scale are just a few examples of the controversies surrounding Nanking. Prominent politicians and public figures have questioned the validity of the massacre, further straining Japan's foreign relations with China. Despite these challenges, many continue to fight for the truth and recognition, both in Japan and globally. Despite resistance, human rights activists and historians continue to advocate for recognition of the Nanking massacre. Some Japanese officials have acknowledged the event, but nationalist groups remain opposed. The United Nations and digital information platforms have played a crucial role in keeping this history alive and accessible for people to witness and remember. Efforts to remember the victims are ongoing as powerful symbols of that commitment. The Nanking Massacre Memorial Hall stands as a powerful tribute to the victims. Annual commemorations in China and educational initiatives worldwide ensure that the memory of Nanking endures. These efforts reaffirm the importance of preserving history and honoring those who have suffered. From remembrance comes responsibility. So what can we learn from this tragedy? The Nanking Massacre underscores the importance of human rights, the need to prevent atrocities, and the value of international cooperation and accountability. It serves as a reminder that acknowledging past crimes is essential for building a more just and equitable world, and who ensures those lessons endure. Historians have played a vital role in preserving the truth of Nanking. Historians play a crucial role in preserving the truth of this massacre. Through ongoing research, debates over death tolls and specific events, and efforts to protect historical evidence, they ensure that this tragedy will remain part of the global narrative and not be forgotten as it already somewhat has. When we compare Nanking to other war crimes, memory and justice can vary dramatically between atrocities. While the Nanking Massacre shares similarities with genocides like the Holocaust, it differs in terms of global recognition and justice. The Holocaust is widely studied and acknowledged, while the Nanking Massacre often remains overshadowed, highlighting disparities in how history is remembered. Looking ahead, how can we ensure that the memory of Nanking remains alive in generations? Ongoing efforts by both Chinese and international institutions aim to document the massacre and increase global awareness about the massacre. The digital world has created archives of survivors' testimonies and educational materials. Initiatives to include the Nanking Massacre in global history curriculum continues to grow, fostering greater understanding and reconciliation about the massacre. The answer lies in justice, just symbolic but legal, real, and societal justice. The path to justice for the Nanking Massacre involves acknowledgement from Japan, advocacy, and legal action. Survivors and their families continue to demand recognition and compensation for what has happened. They are supported by the international organizations and human rights groups. The inclusion of the massacre in global war crime discussions is crucial for achieving closure for the families and the victims alike. To bring everything together, here are the key messages we must carry forward from the Nanking Massacre. The Nanking Massacre exemplifies the consequences of unchecked militarism and nationalism. It highlights the importance of preserving historical truth, promoting education, and advocating for justice. Recognizing this event is vital for ensuring that such atrocities will never be repeated again. Finally, let us reflect on what Nanking means for us today and why remembering it matters more than ever. The Nanking Massacre serves as a harrowing reminder of the horrors of war and human cruelty. Its impact extends beyond history, influencing modern discussions on war crimes, genocide, and justice. By studying and acknowledging these events, we reinforce the importance of human rights, accountability, and education in shaping a more righteous and just world. This video. I hope you all enjoyed it. These right here are my references for if you want to go check it out and see these articles for yourself. I would highly recommend them, and I hope that you all have a great day. Bye!